Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to Everybody Loves Politics. Today we're here with Mike Franklin, who is a council member of the City of Jordan. He's also a public affairs professional in St. Paul here in Minnesota. And let's start with maybe the state of Minnesota and the state legislature and where you think that's going to end up, and if the Democrats are going to get back both houses of the legislature, and kind of where that's at right now.
This is a very unusual election cycle in that there are no statewide races. This sort of confluence happens about once every 12 years, where you'll go into the booth and you'll see the President of the United States, you'll see your member of Congress, and then you'll be right at the Minnesota legislative level. And all 201 legislators are up for re-election or for election. 134 in the House, 67 in the Senate. What's fascinating about this year is that the Democrats, which control the Senate, and the Republicans, which control the House, are sort of mirror images of each other. You have the House, which in 2014 swept to a majority based on largely rural Republicans beating rural Democrats. And they had in the past, the Republicans had held a significant number of suburban seats. Those had all kind of become DFL seats. They thought perhaps that they would get back to the majority with a mix of rural and suburban. In fact, what happened was they swept the rural seats and got swept in the suburban seats, but it was enough for a majority. So they're defending a largely rural majority, but with a few suburban seats left. The Senate, DFL, has a pretty good mix in there. I think they have a 38 or 39 member caucus. I forget precisely how many. I think 39. And there are a lot of rural Democrats, and that, of course, is where now the Republicans are hoping to repeat their gains from 2014, but now take it out on the rural Democratic senators who weren't around or weren't up for re-election in 2014.
Okay. So as we know, 2014 was a particularly good year for the Republican Party.
Sort of. Well, yeah.
Maybe explain. Just nationally, pretty good year.
Nationally, pretty good. In Minnesota, it's been kind of complicated. 2010 and 2014 were both exceptionally good years for the Republicans nationally, and kind of so-so in Minnesota. And what I mean by that is the Minnesota Republican Party has not elected anybody on the top of the ticket since 2006. So
really?
we're in a 10-year streak now, and counting, because there are no statewide races this year, where no Republican is elected statewide. Tim Pawlenty was the last.
Really? Wow.
They're on a streak of 22 years without winning a majority of anything, of a statewide race, which you'd have to go back to Arne Carlson in 1994 to find the last Republican to attain a majority in Minnesota. And that's very disappointing for the Republicans.
State legislature, do you think they're going to flip the House? Do you think it's going to be, what's going to happen there?
I am reasonably confident that the margins of both bodies will shrink. There is right now a sort of healthy Republican margin of 7 in the House. My suspicion is that will be reduced. By how many? I wouldn't hazard a guess. It sort of depends. And I would say the same is true for the Senate. There's a DFL margin in the Senate of about 6. That will, I believe, will correct down towards something less, and it sort of depends as to whether it will cross the line into a Republican majority or not, but it is very, very close. And it is, as I described, the Republicans look to be doing exceptionally well in greater Minnesota, and the further out you get from the Twin Cities, and the Democrats, it's the converse. They're doing exceptionally well in the core cities, in the first-ring suburbs, second-ring suburbs, and then worse and worse and worse as you get out.
So here in Hastings, we have an unusual situation. We have a Senate race that's wide open. The incumbent, Katie Sieben, declined to run this time. House of Representatives, our incumbent, Denny McNamara, retired. Open House seat. Really an interesting situation. We had Sieben and McNamara for, people thought it was a law firm, Sieben and McNamara, for what, 10, 12 years.
Sure.
Both of those seats are open. Is that fairly rare for a community to have that much?
It happens. There's a fair amount of turnover in the legislature generally. I mean, there are certainly examples where you have the kind of stability that you've had in this area. But it is more often than not, I don't know what the average legislative term is, but my guess is it's probably under 10 years.
Right.
If you took the average of everybody. So turnover is sort of normal. In my district in Jordan, we went through that 4 years ago, where our long-serving state senator and long-serving state rep both resigned.
Okay.
And there were new people, and it was unusual, or it seemed unusual, but it really does happen. So.
Good. Well, I think all of the candidates on the ballot this time seem to be good people and well-intentioned, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens in this election for Hastings in this area.
Absolutely.
As well. The elephant in the middle of the room, no pun intended, for Republicans out there is Donald Trump.
Who?
Any idea of how Donald Trump got this far? How did it happen? 17 candidates all the way down. We're now weeks out from him possibly becoming the next president.
Sure. Well, I think I'll set the stage by suggesting that I imagine there will be a good many books written about that very question of how did this happen. If I have to guess, well, the first thing is that actually you sort of mentioned it. There were 17. I mean, there were 16 or whatever there were. There were all of these choices, and so Trump was winning these primaries and caucuses with smallish percentages of the vote.
20% or
20%, 30%.
Right.
I mean, but he was defeating 4 or 5 people at a time that were the primary contenders, and I think that there was a feeling among the, now depending on what you want to call it, the establishment has become a fancy word.
Right.
There was a feeling among the establishment, I'll adopt it for purposes of your show, that eventually this sort of Trump thing would pass, and that people would sort of gravitate toward one of the other sort of more qualified candidates. Well, I think there's a couple things that obviously in retrospect were wrong with that analysis. One, the establishment couldn't decide on one person to sort of be the anti-Trump, or certainly not early enough. And then two, I think they underestimated the level of support that a very vocal populist can amass. And particularly when he doesn't have to, in this case, he doesn't have to accumulate a majority. Now, he did win some states with majorities. I think his defenders would say he won more votes than anybody else in history.
Mitt Romney or anyone else. Right.
And there's something to that. And one of the things that the Trump supporters would also claim is that the Republican offerings for president, really dating back to Ronald Reagan, have been fairly milquetoast and not all that exciting. Things you can't say about Donald Trump.
Exactly.
He's not milquetoast, and he is very exciting.
Yes.
And sort of for good and for bad, depending on where you sit.
He gets a lot of news coverage, a lot of free media coverage, both for saying outlandish things without being partisan about it. They are outlandish things. I would say both parties would agree on that.
I think that's fair.
And things that people, ordinary candidates out there, have never really said things like he's saying before. And Secretary Clinton is out there, not exactly a well-loved individual.
I think that's fair.
Across the country. Both of them have maybe 30 or 40% approval ratings just nationally as far as likability. So you do have a candidate situation where both of them are highly unliked, and it's going to come down to who do you dislike least.
I think that's fair, and I think that's sad, but I think that's exactly right. Famous TV pollster Frank Luntz today had a statement that I don't know if he must have conducted some sort of counterfactual survey, but concluded that Marco Rubio, if we'd have nominated Marco Rubio as Republicans, he'd be winning by 8 points nationally right now.
Okay.
And I don't know how could you possibly do that in a lab? But it seems to jive with common sense. That
or John Kasich.
Or John Kasich, or somebody, who knows, perhaps even Jeb Bush, could have taken advantage of what, other than sort of the significant negatives that have gone along with Donald Trump, should be able to capitalize on some very significant questions about Secretary Clinton. Trump has certainly gone further than I think most Republicans would as far as personally attacking her for those issues. But that's obviously something that does cut both ways. It makes you probably think less of her, but it also makes you think less of him for not conducting himself in a more, frankly, classy manner. Now, I think that some people, and I, you can understand this. I can understand this. I can feel it sometimes. What they admire about him is that he isn't a politician. I mean, he is able to sort of speak truth to power without really having to do any kind of political calculus, which is unusual. We've lived in a very PC world for, gosh, my entire adult lifetime.
Right.
And something like Donald Trump is kind of a breath of fresh air in some ways, depending on your perspective, of course. But Minnesotans are familiar with this phenomenon, and 18 years ago we elected Jesse Ventura, who offered some of the very same medicine to a situation that he found untenable.
And we sit here before the election. I'm sure this will sound crazy, but I'm not so sure that Donald Trump is going to lose. And I know Michael Moore and some others on the left have said, well, this might actually happen. This is the year of the outsider. This is the year of Trump and Sanders. And of course, Hillary had the machine. She had the Democratic Party machine behind her. There was no way she was going to be denied the nomination. I was a fan of Martin O'Malley. You know how well that turned out.
Right.
So, but you have Sanders is filling arenas and college campuses. Donald Trump is filling arenas all over the country. Places where you wouldn't necessarily think a Republican would be popular. Hey, I've seen that guy on The Apprentice, and they feel like they know him over the years, over 30 years of, he's a successful billionaire, he's on TV, I have his book, I have Trump the Game.
Sure.
He
owes nothing to nobody.
Right.
That he's his own man and he's not beholden to any political machine.
So when he comes out, like a Jesse comes out, and I remember Jesse back in '98 was well in third place until about now, until about 2 or 3 weeks in the race. And then it started to come back. And then Humphrey and Coleman started to use Ventura as someone that was in their TV commercials and would start to go after Jesse because they thought he was more of a threat at that point. And Jesse obviously won. So I'm not so sure that Trump is going to do as poorly as, if he loses, I'm not sure it's going to be as much of a landslide as people are predicting.
I tend to agree with you, although I'm not sure of that either. I'm not sure of anything anymore. Of course, unlike Jesse, he's a major party endorsed candidate.
Yes.
And it's very curious to me that back to the question of how did this happen? Trump shares, depending on your perspective, very few to only some of the sort of core Republican principles, or if he shares them, he seems to be kind of a late comer to them.
Yeah.
And even the ones that he's sort of running on, sort of economic populism that reminds you of Dick Gephardt, and
protectionism.
And protectionism,
right.
Really, that reminds you, and a cultural stroke of sort of Pat Buchanan, who was booted out of the Republican Party in the 1990s, and so he's in many ways his coalition that could get him over the top will not look at all like a regular Republican coalition, which if his personal qualities were a little different, I think a lot of us would be celebrating because we were looking nationally at a party that did seem to be shrinking and not adding people. Trump's adding people,
right?
He's losing people, but he's also adding people.
Yeah.
Michael Moore, you mentioned, no further lefty than he did this amazing talk, a chunk of which is going around, and I think he's doing a documentary called Trumpland.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And there's this talk where he's sort of giving voice to the Trump voter, and he talks about how they're not racist, they're not sexist, they're from small towns, they used to work in manufacturing until they lost that job, and they're maybe divorced and they can't make the bills pay, and now they've got to pay more for health care. and he refers to the states where you find folks like this in as Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan and West Virginia and Wisconsin and even Minnesota. He refers to them as the Brexit states. When there's a lot of that is it's a good analysis. I'm not sure I share Michael Moore's conclusions. However, you can certainly follow the logic that got him here.
Definitely, definitely. So, I mean, I can definitely see, I think there's a path for him to succeed. I don't think it's necessarily going to happen. I think, but there is we have 2 weeks left before the election, but with the WikiLeaks or something happens, I think I read something the other day that Hillary, this is hers to lose unless they find evidence that she's involved in some sort of homicide or something like that. And then I thought, oh no, Vince Foster.
Yeah, right, or Ron Brown, or
right, Ron Brown.
To be kind of a lengthy list
the
at
plane
one point.
crash, right. So someone from Whitewater or something like this, who knows what they might do.
Well,
But
it's stunning to me that in a sort of ordinary presidential year, you have a major party candidate who seems to be now facing very significant charges of taking money from foreign governments in exchange for favors, and whether there's validity to those charges or not, you're not hearing that candidate having to deny them.
Right.
She's dancing around them in a way where she's very much running this sort of ball control campaign where I'm not him is the basic function of her campaign. I don't know what that says about the next 4 years if she's elected, which I believe will happen. We could be in for an even uglier 4 years because under that scenario, if Donald Trump sort of fades away, which is I guess its own question, if he fades away, then the focus resumes on some of these very significant and troubling charges against President Clinton under that dynamic.
yeah. So your crystal ball, Mike. You have a crystal ball, and you're looking at this. It's election night, November 8th. What do you see? Electoral College. When do you think it's going to be called? How far west is that map going to go before it's called for Hillary?
Well, I tend to think we'll know pretty early.
Okay.
The states that are in play include a lot of East Coast states. So you're talking. I mean, put it this way: if Trump doesn't win Florida, there's really no path for him.
Okay.
If Trump doesn't win Ohio, there's really no path for him. If Trump does win Pennsylvania, that starts to look like there may be no path for Secretary Clinton. My prediction would be if Trump wins Pennsylvania, he will already have won Ohio and Florida, and at that point you're looking at President Trump. But all those states are in the Eastern time zone. I do think it will be. I do think Secretary Clinton will win. I think that the current dynamic, I mean, even where now Trump's kind of pulling back to being competitive in the polls, it's still about a 6-point deficit on average. That's more than what Mitt Romney faced in 2012. That's more than what John McCain faced in 2008. We don't elect a president on a national popular vote, of course, but he's trailing in all of the key states. In some states by a very little, by a point or two, but in many states by a lot more than that. So his sort of map, right now, if you just look at the Real Clear Politics average of the states that are either solidly Democratic or leans Democratic, Secretary Clinton already has 252 votes locked up out of 270.
Right.
So she essentially has to win one more big state. And Donald Trump is sitting at 126. He's got to run the table.
Okay.
So I tend to think it'll be. I agree with you that it may be when the counting's over, it may look a lot closer than it currently looks. But I think in the Electoral College, it'll be a solid Hillary Clinton victory.
Okay.
And when you replay this for me in 3 weeks and it went the other way, the crystal ball is cracked. I'm admitting that today. I didn't see much of this year coming. So
If we're looking at President-elect Trump and a Republican sweep of all the Senate races or something like that, the Senate, the House, obviously both under Republican control now at the United States level, the federal level. Do you think the Democrats are going to take the Senate? Probably the House is out of the question, but do you think the Democrats will take the Senate?
I think if you'd asked me that question about a year and a half ago, I'd have said, yeah, absolutely.
Really?
Because the states that the Republicans are defending include all the presidential swing states and a lot of states that went for President Obama twice. Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina went for Obama once. Nevada went for Obama twice. Iowa, Arizona, looking at Indiana, New Hampshire, Missouri, I think all but maybe a couple of those states went for Obama at least one time.
Sure.
And in most of those cases, Illinois went for him 2 times. So the Republicans are defending the states they won in 2002, which was the Joe the Plumber year, or excuse me,
2008.
And
Right.
2010, excuse me.
Oh, okay, right
2010,
after
the
midterm.
the midterm, the first Obama midterm, which was a massacre for Democrats nationwide. Now they're defending all the seats that they won that year, and in many cases they're likely to lose those seats. What's interesting and add Donald Trump on top of that.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that it does seem unclear sitting here today that they have an obvious path to 50 votes, which is what it would take if Hillary Clinton's president, to a majority. And some of these states, Florida, you have Marco Rubio. I almost said Ricky Rubio. Would that be something? Double dipping. Marco Rubio, surprisingly running for re-election. He seems to be doing fairly well. Rob Portman in Ohio is up by 15 points on average. He's doing very well. Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, a bluish state, seems to be doing fine. Richard Burr in North Carolina. Some of these senators, I think the Trump label is not sticking the way that I think Democrats had hoped. Another way to look at that could be that Hillary Clinton herself is so unpopular that people may be willing to sort of hold their nose and vote for her, but put a check in place as far as a Republican Senate or a Republican Congress is concerned.
Checks and balances.
I've heard that theory that in some of these states, people may vote for Hillary and for a Republican for the U.S. Senate.
Interesting.
And we're seeing some of that in Minnesota here too, where I think the very competitive race, as it looked to be in Minnesota's 3rd district, Congressman Paulson, the whole race was about Trump.
Yeah.
And it just hasn't stuck.
Right.
And so people are distinguishing, and it's probably a whole number of things. I mean, Trump has never been a Republican until recently. He's not espousing Republican viewpoints. The current Republican Speaker of the House has done all but unendorse him. So
exactly.
he's effectively running as an independent.
Well, Mike, so much to talk about, so little time, unfortunately. So we're going to have to wrap it up here. But we'd definitely like to have you back on the show.
Oh, I'd love to be. This is fun.
In probably a few months or something like that, if you come down to Hastings. And Mike, we appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks, Tom.
And we'll talk to you soon.
A lot of fun.
So here's a thought. Odds are by the time you're watching this, the 2016 election will be over. And we'll know who will represent us in the White House, in Congress, at the state legislature, and at Hastings City Hall starting in January. So now the hard part starts for those who won on November 8th. They'll actually have to do something other than just ask for our votes around the clock. Of course, I would hope that all candidates running this year, in addition to campaigning, had already planned for what they would do when elected, well before voters went to the polls. Let's imagine for a minute that you're at work and it's time for your performance review. Most people would agree that it's not enough to just accomplish the bare minimum, or enough just to keep your job. Your boss is going to ask you for a plan that lays out what you're going to do in the months and years ahead. The same goes for political candidates, where the election serves as the performance review they're getting from voters. Just like your boss in that performance review, voters not only want to know what you have done to deserve re-election, they want to know what you plan to do for them in the future. They want their voices to be heard and not to be taken for granted. Voters want to hear from you more often than every 4 years when you're standing on their doorstep or in the newspaper asking for their vote. Yet some elected officials seem to think that once they get into office, they somehow own that position and are entitled to return term after term. And that's often what happens in places where there aren't term limits. Incumbents are re-elected more than 80% of the time. They benefit from taxpayer-paid mailings, news coverage, meetings on TV, and endorsements from individuals, sometimes even from other elected officials who have a vested interest in keeping them in office to forward their own agendas. Some incumbent politicians throughout history have gone to great lengths to stay in office, even if they're fairly well established and likely to win re-election. Take President Richard Nixon, for example, who in 1972 ordered the criminal break-in and burglary of his opponent's campaign headquarters. Nixon, of course, went on to win 49 states, only to resign in disgrace less than 2 years later in the Watergate scandal. Nixon perceived that he was going to somehow lose and went to extraordinary and illegal means to win at any cost. When campaigning, whether at the national, state, or even local level, is reduced to doing and saying whatever it takes to get elected, no matter what, it's really a sad state of affairs. I'd like to think candidates, whether they're incumbents or challengers, would be better than this. But unfortunately, some folks can't seem to help themselves. Oftentimes, the worst campaign tactics are perpetrated by state or national political parties, or PACs, which, thanks to the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court, allow an endless flow of negative advertising on television, online, in newspapers, and postcards. Over the last month of the campaign in the race for the state legislature, for example, I received political postcards from both parties stating that their opponents hate children, are liberal lapdogs, they love the Ayatollah, and are opposed to quality public education. And while candidates will dismiss these mailings by saying they have no control over what their political parties send out about other candidates, I wish more of them would stand up and say it's wrong, even if it costs them a few votes. I'm convinced that in any campaign at any level, people simply want to hear what you're going to do for them and how you plan to do it. If you're fortunate enough to win an election and earn the voters' trust, the best advice I have for you is to take the time to listen to the people you were elected to represent. After all, you didn't buy your seat, you're renting it, and the people who elected you own it. Work hard, be honest, make yourself available, and re-election will take care of itself. I'm Tom Bullington. We'll see you next time on Everybody Loves Politics.